planted.
I, Franklin Delano Roosevelt.
The torch has been passed.
Retro News. It's a blast from the past.
Hi, I'm Mark.
And I'm Kendall. This is Retro News, the show that digs through the archives of news history to bring you the important and not so important stories.
Today, our cameras are focused on historic events that happened in the month of April. We'll watch as artists carve faces in a Mount Rushmore with dynamite, see an underwater boxing match, and a deer that eats at the dining room table. But first, let's take a look at aviation.
In April of 1930, Charles Lindbergh set a record flying coast to coast in 14 hours and 45 minutes. Yeah, that was the record. Today, that trip takes less than 6 hours.
A week later, Lindbergh opened a new mail route to South America. His mom went along with him as far as Washington, D.C. She had no luggage, just a parachute.
For more high-flying stories, we go to reporters Brennan and Rachel.
Thanks, guys. A year after Lindbergh flew mail to South America, Roger Wolf Kahn was the first pilot to successfully pick up mail without landing the plane. A mail bag was loaded into a catapult on top of a building. Kahn swooped down just a few feet above the building and snagged the postal pouch just as it was flung from the rooftop. Delivering the mail was a lot easier.
In April 1933, the Navy tested the largest airships in the world. These things were huge, the size of cruise ships. Because they could stay in the air for days at a time, the Navy was going to use this one, the USS Macon, for spying, but many airships were for traveling in style. They had dining rooms, lounges, decks, and even sleeping compartments.
What if planes had skis? That's what the Navy wondered when they built Hercules. As air frontiers moved ever north, members of Task Force Slide in Minnesota equipped a huge cargo troop carrier with skis mounted outside the wheels. Weighing 62 tons, it carried a 20-ton cargo at 350 miles an hour. Its 4 turbo-prop engines lifted it into the air after an incredibly short run. The skis would retract with the wheels. The wheels can be substituted at the flick of a switch. It landed like a feather as the huge skis took up the shock. A real Arctic adventure, this Hercules.
How about a plane that lands on water? In April of 1935, the Pan American Clipper, a flying boat, made flight number 1 from California to Hawaii. This was the first scheduled flight across a major ocean. The crew of 6, carrying only mail, flew from Wake Island, California to Honolulu, Hawaii in 18 hours and 39 minutes. Later that year, they began taking passengers. The classic flying boat was pretty luxurious back then. Plenty of leg room. When they took off toward Hawaii, they had a good view of the unfinished Golden Gate Bridge below them. In April 1959, Pan Am celebrated its 50,000th flight. The Trans-Pacific run was no longer an adventure, just routine, in less than a generation.
But not all innovations were in the air. Take a look at this mini car. It could fit in an elevator and use the top of the Empire State Building as a speedway.
Speaking of the Empire State Building, in April 1956, it got lights on top. It was the tallest building in the world at the time.
April 2nd, 1513, Ponce de Leon spots Florida and claims it for Spain.
April also marks the deaths of 2 popular presidents, Abraham Lincoln in 1865 and Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1945. Both led the country through troubled times and war.
I, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States and will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. So help me God.
In 1932, Franklin Roosevelt was elected president for the first of 4 times. He guided our country through 12 of the most difficult years in our history with optimism, compassion, and radical new ideas. When he took office in 1932, 1 out of every 4 working Americans was unemployed. Factories had shut down, farms went broke, and banks were closed. People had lost their jobs, their homes, and their dignity. Roosevelt thought it was the duty of the government to help its people, so he came up with what he called a New Deal. He put millions of people to work for the government building roads, dams, bridges, and schools. Laws were created to protect workers from long hours and low pay. The Social Security system was begun to protect the elderly when they could no longer work. His plan was working. Then, in 1941, another crisis. The Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor in Hawaii.
I ask that we declare that since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
When it became clear that America and its allies would win the war, he worked with other countries to develop the United Nations, an international group of leaders he hoped would keep the peace between countries.
The Conference of the United Nations on International Organization is now convened.
Roosevelt did all of this from a wheelchair. A virus called polio had paralyzed his legs 4 years before he became president. Some say his disability was the reason he had so much compassion for people who suffered during the Depression. In April 1945, Franklin Roosevelt died, 6 months after being re-elected for the 4th time. Joining me now is Professor Whatsit. Professor, Eleanor Roosevelt is known as the president's eyes and ears. What does that mean?
Well, because the president was disabled, Eleanor traveled the country to see everything he couldn't. She was able to bring him back stories of what life was like for the unemployed and their children. And when the president's New Deal programs took effect, she was able to bring him firsthand news of what they were doing.
Eleanor Roosevelt is often called the most powerful First Lady in history. How did she use her influence?
Well, Eleanor was always a strong advocate of social justice. Before she was First Lady, she worked very hard to end child labor and to establish a minimum wage for adults. Then as First Lady, she worked very hard for civil rights.
What kinds of things did she do?
Well, Eleanor noticed in her travels that many African Americans were being discriminated against in the president's New Deal programs. She was able to bring this information back to the president, and he, in turn, created executive orders that prevented the discrimination.
Mrs. Roosevelt was the first First Lady to hold an all-female press conference. What was she thinking?
She was very clever. This forced news organizations to go out and hire female journalists because only they could have access to the First Lady. She actually held 300 of these conferences. Eleanor really wanted to wake people up. Unfortunately, in those days, many people were denied opportunities based on their religion, their race, or their gender. Eleanor really wanted Americans to move beyond that point of view.
Thanks, Professor Whatsit. Now, here's our retro quiz.
In April 1932, a department store installed the world's largest clock. What country was it in? I will be back with the answer later in the show.
April 9, 1866. African Americans are granted the rights and privileges of citizenship when Congress passes the Civil Rights Bill.
In April 1959, the first astronauts were chosen. 110 test pilots signed up for some of the toughest mental and physical tests NASA could come up with. When they were done, 7 men were chosen for Project Mercury. Among those selected were Alan Shepard and John Glenn. The rest is history. Brandy Mitchell has the pictures.
Thanks, Mark. Well, what goes up must come down. But once you get a man into space, how do you bring him back to Earth safely? That was the question scientists were trying to solve in 1959. Ed Herlihy filed this story.
Problem, to bring a man back from space. Three rockets carry aloft a full-scale model of the capsule that will take America's first spaceman into orbit when Project Mercury reaches its goal. This is a test of the mechanism that will return the manned capsule at flight's end. Defense Department films show the successful culmination of the automatic parachute that will slow the capsule's fall through the atmosphere. Without this braking device on the actual flight, the capsule's speed would be so high, it would be consumed by heat from air friction and never reach the ground. Success today is an encouraging step forward for the civilian space agency.
Meanwhile, the Russians were also trying to get a man into space. Both the Americans and the Russians wanted to be first. In April of 1961, the Russians sent this footage to American news organizations.
Official Soviet films of recent space tests involving dogs, rats, and mice as rocket passengers. Scenes like these have rarely been released by Russia, despite their progress in space research. Recent reports indicate the Reds are pressing their man-in-space program at least as vigorously as America. Now come these scenes of a recent high-altitude firing. Dogs are the test subjects rather than chimpanzees. The recovery of the passenger capsule in these films comes off without a hitch. This is the culmination of a high-altitude test, not a firing into orbit. But for the animal passengers, it's the end of a baffling ordeal of strange experiences, and the chief reaction seems to be, gee, it's great to be back.
And the winner is the Russians by 25 days. Yuri Gagarin was the first man in space on April 12, 1961. He didn't operate any controls. He was just a passenger, but a very brave passenger. When he got home to Moscow, he was a hero. The cosmonaut, hailed as Russia's man of the century, arrived at the airport outside of Moscow to make his first public appearance. Major Gagarin walked a long red carpet to a platform where Russian leader Nikita Khrushchev waited. This rare Russian footage shows the crowd going wild when they caught a glimpse of the first man to conquer space. The daring pilot thanked his countrymen for the opportunity to blast into space. The two celebrated with a big bear hug. Yuri's trip into space lasted only an hour and 48 minutes, once around the Earth, and then he dropped into Kazakhstan. A few months later in August, the Russians sent the first woman to space. The first man on the moon was an American in 1969.
The most famous scientist in the world died on April 18, 1955. Albert Einstein changed the way man thought about the universe. His theories led to the development of electronics, quantum physics, space travel, and atomic power. He joined the faculty at Princeton University in 1935. When asked what supplies he'd need, he answered, "A desk, some pads, and a pencil, and a big wastebasket for all of my mistakes."
April 3rd, 1860. The first rider for the Pony Express leaves Missouri and arrives in Sacramento, California 10 days later.
A young scientist named Jonas Salk conquered polio, one of the most dreaded diseases of the 20th century, in April 1955. Polio is a virus. For 50 years, it terrified the country with epidemics that seemed to come out of nowhere and were practically unstoppable. The virus left many crippled or unable to breathe without help from machines called iron lungs. Because polio was so easy to catch, panicked parents often kept their children out of school. Many avoided public places, such as movie theaters and swimming pools, during outbreaks. Finally, in April 1955, a vaccine that could prevent polio was announced. The Salk vaccine rolled out of drug houses all over the country for immediate use on millions of children. Families lined up for vaccines. Polio vaccination drives became common in the 50s and 60s. Whole communities would turn out. In 1957, Ed Hurley filed this story from Protection, Kansas.
Citizens of Protection, Kansas are really getting protection. The Tots are the first to face the Salk vaccine needle. This miss isn't quite sure about the whole thing, but, well, it really wasn't so bad. Next. Junior is blissful, but he gets the idea. Listen. Double trouble, but the twins don't seem to mind. Don't even grind their teeth. Some get a boot out of it. Witness this Moffat, who has the makings of a great actress. Gideon Bison of Oklahoma and his dad, a medicine man, are putting the Indian sign on polio as they join the protection drive.
In 1994, the dreaded polio virus was declared eliminated in all of the Americas. Now here's Alexis with a word on President Abraham Lincoln.
Abraham Lincoln led our country through the Civil War, held the Union together, and ended slavery. During this time, he often looked to God for inspiration and strength. He encouraged the rest of the country to do the same in many of his speeches.
With charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right, we shall bind up the nation's wounds and cherish peace.
In a proclamation he wrote in 1863, he said, "Even though our country's at war, we have a lot to be thankful for. We are at peace with other countries, order is being maintained, laws are being obeyed, and people can still make a living." Because of these gracious gifts, Lincoln asked that the last Thursday of the month of November be a day of thanksgiving and praise to God. Because of his proclamation, Thanksgiving is a national holiday that we still observe today. Abraham Lincoln is our spiritual hero for April.
The 1950s were a happy time. World War II was over and America had won. People were still celebrating in 1957 when this collection of spring fashions was presented. During the war, fabric was in short supply, so skirts were straight. After the war, full skirts and luxurious fabrics were very popular. Cocktail parties were the rage and gave people a reason to dress up. The Italian designer Pucci took the fashion war by storm with his capri pants in 1949. They were still a popular style in 57. In fact, they were pretty popular now. My favorite is this handy outfit, the detachable sports dress, designed to go from the barbecue to the beach. April fashions wouldn't look the same without Easter bonnets. Take a look at these crazy caps whipped up in a Mad Hatter's kitchen. It looks like an average garden party, but look closer. Those hats are made of hardware. An ice scoop with a lovely pot scrubber accent is just the thing for spring. How about this kitchen crown? Embellished with cutlery. Say cheese, this one's the cat's meow. The future looks bright when you're wearing a shiny tin bonnet. One thing's for sure, these hats are brimming with creativity.
The first African-American to play Major League Baseball was Jackie Robinson. He joined the Brooklyn Dodgers in April of 1947. For more sports milestones, we go to Adriana and Michael.
Bowling can be traced back to the Egyptians, but really wasn't very popular until about 1895, when rules were finally agreed on. Bowling alleys got really busy after the first electronic pin setter was built. Before that, pin boys would set the pins up after every frame. Take a look.
A bonanza for bowling alley operators looms with the first commercial installation of the newest automatic pin setter, claimed by its makers to solve all the problems that made previous pin setters unworkable. Not electronic, but mechanical, it boasts economy, compactness, and foolproof operation, quick and accurate. Kegglers will benefit too, if only by saving on tips to pin boys. But actually, there are other boons in store which really add up in terms of the nation's millions of bowlers. A major stride forward in facilities for the sport that's fast becoming America's all-time favorite.
In the 1930s, when money was scarce, people came up with a lot of unusual ways to entertain themselves. A lot of strange fads were born, like marathon dancing and flagpole sitting. Here's a combination of the two, flagpole dancing. This couple is going for a record. We don't know any more about it, but it sure is fun to watch.
in April of 1956, one of the world's few women bullfighters met her match.
From Colombia, a story of amazing courage and determination. In the ring, facing El Toro, is a 26-year-old girl, Bertha Trujillo. 6 years ago, the senorita set out to become the world's top woman bullfighter. She hasn't gotten there yet. Most of her fights like this are in provincial arenas, but Bertha's courage has won incredulous admiration from Colombia's bullfight fans, the aficionados. This fight is typical. It's one of her worst defeats ever, incidentally. She came back to defeat 3 bulls in a row after a few weeks in the hospital from this fight. 7 battering knockdowns in 15 minutes. Bertha's chosen a rugged road to fame and fortune, but she's just the girl to go the distance. Why, she wants to go back into the ring.
Okay, here it is, just like we promised. Underwater boxing.
Now here's a story of a real boxer, Muhammad Ali. Former world heavyweight champion Muhammad Ali refused to report for duty in the Army in April of 1967. The African-American fighter was immediately stripped of his title by the World Boxing Association. Ali insisted that he was an ordained minister and shouldn't have to join. He faced federal prosecution and a possible prison sentence plus a $10,000 fine. Later, Martin Luther King praised Ali's courage. Ali lost his title and his license to box, but still stood up for what he believed in. Kendall is here with Professor Whatsit to give us a little more insight on this story.
Thanks, Michael. Professor, why was Muhammad Ali in trouble because he didn't want to go into the Army?
Well, today we have an all-volunteer Army. In other words, everyone who's in the service has joined voluntarily. But in the 1960s, when we were fighting the Vietnam War, men were called into service really whenever the government thought it was necessary. This was called being drafted. The men really had no choice.
So, if they refused to go, they were breaking the law?
That's right.
Ali said that he shouldn't have to go because he was a minister. Why not?
Well, like many others at that time, Muhammad Ali was a conscientious objector. These were people who felt that they couldn't fight in a war for religious reasons. They committed themselves to nonviolence or believed that Christians should remain neutral in times of world conflict. Now, the government sometimes excused the conscientious objectors, but not always. Many people did go to prison.
Thanks, Professor. Now, for a look at April birthdays, we go to Victoria.
Make a wish and blow out candles for Wilbur Wright, who, with his brother Orville, invented the airplane. Guglielmo Marconi, the wizard of the wireless. Before telephones, he invented a way to send telegraphic signals across the ocean so messages could be sent from ships to sea back to shore. Booker T. Washington, a teacher who grew the Tuskegee Institute from a single building to a modern university. And Hans Christian Andersen, the author of The Princess and the Pea, The Little Mermaid, and many other fairy tales.
April 18th, Paul Revere begins his midnight ride to warn the Patriots the British are coming. The next day, the shot heard around the world is fired and the Revolutionary War is begun.
Watch that side pocket. That's calling your shots, and if you're still skeptical, here it is again.
In April of 1933, they were having a blast at Mount Rushmore. The face of George Washington begins to emerge from the stone of Mount Rushmore as local miners, directed by artist Gutzon Borglum, blast away more than 450,000 pounds of granite. Powder men would use dynamite to rough out the faces. Then, drillers would make closely spaced holes at specific depths. Men with chisels would follow to cut away the stone between the holes. The work continued on and off from 1927 to 1941. Throughout the Great Depression, 400 unemployed miners found work on Mount Rushmore. Drillers made $1.25 an hour, fair pay at the time.
Here's the answer to the Retro News quiz. In April 1932, a department store installed the world's largest clock. What country was it in? The clock was in Tokyo, Japan. It covered the front of a 6-story building from top to bottom. Watch out for the big can.
Ever play with the yo-yo?
They've been around forever. Well, at least 2,500 years.
The yo-yo is the oldest toy in history, after the doll.
Yo-yos were used in the Philippines as weapons for over 400 years.
Back in the 1930s, yo-yo makers used to hold contests for the best tricks or styles. These competitions made yo-yos very popular.
1 month in 1931, 3 million yo-yos were sold just in the Philadelphia area.
In 1947, a new super yo-yo rolled onto the scene from Canada. It was called Cheerio.
Take a look.
From Houston, Texas, come 3 cheers and Cheerio. Cheerio is a revised form of yo-yo, and you all know what that is. Well, Super Yo-Yo, or Cheerio, has been imported into Texas by 9 Canadian chaps who are instructing the school kids in the technical difference between the two pastimes. The Dominion experts say that Cheerio, with its smoother axle and better balance, is a top-notch sporting device. There's apparently no end to the tricks you can do with it. Here's the cue ball shot, or watch that side pocket. That's calling your shots, and if you're still skeptical, here it is again. Bullseye. Now for a medley of Cheerio tricks. First, the magic twirl, or who's got the yo-yo? And then there's the version of spank the baby and watch her behave. Cheerio.
Here's some clips that we found in the archive that we've got to show you. First, from Boulder, Colorado in 1934, the deer that eats at the dining room table.
The pet deer, sporting a velvet ribbon, laps up its breakfast off of a china plate on a table, then tops it off with a nice cup of tea. There's always room for a banana. Then she's ready to cruise through Colorado in the back seat. Try getting your cat to do that.
Here's something you don't see every day. A monkey driving a train. This hairy engineer was the hit of an amusement resort in Venice, California, back in April of 1930.
That's our Retro News Report for April.
Be here next week when we meet the first woman to fly across the Atlantic alone.
And we'll see the last of the great airships.
See you next time.